Hey guys, so as you may have heard, we are currently in a global pandemic. As everybody does their part, we at Messy Modern Ministry would also like to do our part. Therefore, all of our episodes currently are being recorded remotely through Zoom. And so we would like to apologize for any audio that is not yet up to our standard that we want it to be and that it will eventually be. Nevertheless, we hope you guys enjoy the episode and we're going to get right into it.
Welcome to Messy Modern Ministry, a resource where we equip leaders to navigate the ups and downs of ministry in our modern world. My name is Kristen.
And I'm Joe.
And we are so excited to have you join us today.
On this episode, Kelvin Walker, a minister for 32 years, pastoring in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. He now is a district superintendent and oversees 123 churches in the metro area for the Christian Missionary Alliance. He has also been a professor at NIAC and Alliance Theological Seminary for 14 years. So, Kelvin, welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have Kelvin here. Honestly, when I had first started dreaming up the podcast, I made a list of people that I said, I need to have this person on, and Kelvin was one of them. He was actually a professor of mine at Alliance Theological Seminary, and I just learned so much from him. Kelvin, I'm just really excited to have you and to have this conversation with you.
Well, thanks again. I'm very, very pleased to be here. Very honored to be here.
Today, we are going to be talking about racial reconciliation in the church and kind of the role that the church plays in that topic. So would you mind just kind of going into that and explaining what that might mean to some people that might not understand?
When we talk about racial reconciliation, I think in order to understand it, I look at it from the perspective, a biblical perspective of Revelation 7, where it talks about every tongue, tribe, and nation being before the throne of God. We are people who are made up of many different races and cultures. Each of those races and cultures have different ways of approaching life. And sometimes those things have divided. And when you look at just even a history of race in America and a history of race in the church, there's been a divide where there's been no working together. The importance of working together is it's biblical, that we would be united as one. And so racial reconciliation is about getting the races and the cultures together at the table, talking through the issues that have divided us and praying through them and working through them so that we move forward in unity. So that's just a basic background, a backdrop for what I would say.
I wasn't in your Race, Culture, Kingdom of God class specifically, but I know that you were involved in the curriculum. I thought I had known a good amount before that, but I sat in that class and just learned so much I didn't know. And something that I learned in class is just this conversation about our Sunday mornings, the most segregated days of the week. Our Sunday mornings, our churches, we're not necessarily as multicultural as we might say that we are. Is that true?
Yes, it is. I mean, some of the reasons for that might be location. There are some areas that just are not diverse. So I understand that. But in places where there is great diversity, great representation of races and cultures from all different backgrounds, it still tends to be, this group worships over here, this group worships over here. And the place where we should see the unity and the working together, Sunday morning still tends to be the most segregated hour of the week.
Right now, we are seeing some very high-profile cases happening in the news. We're seeing a lot of conversations about the Ahmaud Arbery case and Breonna Taylor as well. And I'm seeing so many people have this conversation on social media and links popping up on YouTube. And it's so good for us to be having these conversations. But this obviously isn't a conversation we should only wait to have when we have a high-profile situation that occurs.
You're right. I don't think that these high-profile cases should all of a sudden cause us to now start having the conversation. However, where there hasn't been the conversation, if these cases raise the conversation and raise action and gets churches that haven't been mindful of issues of injustice, mindful of it now, then we need to do it.
What would you say is the role as believers and the role as the church?
Well, I think there are people who would ask, is the idea of addressing injustice even something that the church should do? And my response would be, yeah. I mean, Micah 6:8 tells us that the Lord requires of us that we would do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with our God. If you look through the book of Isaiah, there's a lot of talk through the book of Isaiah about God's displeasure with the injustices that were being done. And they say, well, okay, that's Old Testament. What about New Testament? Well, a great passage in the New Testament to talk about injustice is in Romans, where Paul and Silas were put in jail. The jail shakes, they're set free. The jailer and his family come to Christ. And then the jailer's like, well, you can go. Paul's response to him is, no, wait a minute. I'm a Roman citizen. What took place and what you did to a Roman citizen. And so I'm going to wait here until the officials realize what they've done to a Roman citizen. We look at that, but we miss the point that that's all about justice. There was an injustice done, and justice needed to be served. So I look at this and I say, along with a friend of mine who pastors in Brooklyn, when you talk about issues of justice, it's not political, it's biblical. The church should be the one leading the way in speaking out against injustice and saying this should not be anywhere present. I think sometimes in the white church, the fear of jumping into this because people feel like, well, I'm going to be blamed for this. I'm just tired of being blamed. And what I want to say is this is not about blame. This is about responsibility. That you need to have the conversation. It's not because someone wants to blame you, but we need to have the conversation because we all have a responsibility as believers to speak up and speak out. If we don't have this conversation, you have no idea what you're speaking out against.
Yeah, so Kelvin, I think sometimes the conversation's really hard because if we're being really brutally honest and raw about the conversation, I think that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily see things as injustice, or maybe they have 1,000 reasons as to why this situation's different or this situation's different. And so could you kind of just tell us some facts about how we can see that there is injustice?
I think first we have to look at the history in our country. Again, this is a country where injustice was part of, whether or not we want to admit it, it was part of our founding. And then if we look at the history of injustice in the country, we also then have to look at the church. And there were things that were supported in the church and promoted in the church that were not biblical when it came to how people were treated, how races were treated, and the differences that were applied. Just even looking at our judicial system and our criminal system, when you look at the number of minorities, particularly African Americans, who are incarcerated, and how that affects life as things go on, it's not a just way of dealing with life. I think the issue is we look at simply the situation, but we don't go deeper to see the systems that perpetuate these things. And if we're going to have this conversation openly and honestly, we have to be prepared to look at the systems behind what we see. And that's what we have to go after in order to push change.
When you say system, are you talking about the system in the church or the system in our country?
I would say it's the system in our country, but we also have to look at, for the church, if we're going to be people who say we are moving forward as people who are not only embracing different races and cultural backgrounds, we have to look at our own systems and say, hey, where have we not made space for there to be diversity that's engaged and welcomed and allowed to serve on equal planes? So yes, I do think it is a systemic thing in the country, but I also think as we begin to have hard conversations in the church, it forces us to look at our own systems and our own ways of doing things, and they have to be addressed. Again, these are hard conversations, but they're necessary.
Right, absolutely. And so I know we started talking about systems and systems in the country. I know you mentioned mass incarceration. I know that there is like a discrepancy about buying a house. So where are these other injustices that maybe people aren't aware there's discrepancies in the numbers?
Yeah, there used to be something called redlining. And redlining really it was basically a system put in place where African Americans in particular were not allowed to be shown certain houses in certain areas or buy in certain areas. And while that's been outlawed, it still happens, probably more than people realize. Because of that, there are certain areas that are meant to be only one group of people, and people fight, not maybe overtly, but covertly, to keep it that way. When you look at history, there are a number of laws that were passed that really affected certain groups of people more harshly. You know, whether there was the three strikes law, where if you were caught with a crime, particularly around drugs, there's three strikes and you get the harshest sentence. That affected the African American community way more than it affected anyone else. And so you see this in the judicial system, the number of people who are incarcerated is disproportionately high in the minority community. And all of these things are things that if you're going to have the conversation, you have to talk about it as a big picture thing. And the reason why I say it's important for the church to have these conversations, because I believe it's only the church that can bring change.
Wow.
You know, when you talk about reconciliation, it's a heart thing, and you can't legislate the heart. You can change all kinds of laws, but you can't legislate a person's heart. But I think the church is called to and positioned to be the voice, not only in the religious arena, but in the secular arena, to say, this should not be. And this is not the way that God has designed it.
And Kelvin, I just want to be really, really clear as you're talking about the disproportionate numbers of people being incarcerated. The numbers are disproportionate for people who are serving longer sentences for the same crimes. That's the kind of thing you're talking about?
Longer sentences for the same crime, harsher treatment, and the effect of how it follows later on in life. It's longer lasting. Usually it's a group of people who don't have the same kinds of access to a legal defense. It becomes almost like you already know two people are standing in front of a court. This group is going to be charged more harshly and have fewer opportunities to defend themselves well. And the church has to speak to it. Church has to speak to it.
Now, I know you talked about everything on a macro level. I want to talk a little bit on a micro level. You personally, as a pastor, have you ever experienced something firsthand, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, I personally have experienced going into stores where I know I'm being watched. I've personally experienced the fear of what will happen if I get pulled over. In fact, I had my son in the car with me one night, and it was a dark road. I won't say where it was because I don't want to talk about any particular community, but I knew as we're driving, you know, we begin to talk just about the things that can happen. And I did get pulled over. And he's sitting in the car with me and he's watching what I'm doing. I didn't plan it, but it was almost like a in the moment education for him. The biggest thing is just being in places where I know I'm being followed. I have been treated with disrespect. There are places where I knew that I was not even getting a chance to get a front door interview because I was Black. When I talk about these things, it's not simply this is the picture I've heard. These are things I've experienced and things that I've walked through. So I think part of the way forward is being able to hear narratives of things that people have walked through firsthand and listening, not from the perspective of let me wait to see if I can jump in with a rebuttal.
Right.
But listening from the perspective of what I would call lamenting with the other person, sitting in their spot, sitting in their shoes and empathizing with them, because I think that would then help understand why this is something the church needs to speak to.
I just not too long ago had a conversation with somebody who told me that they had to have a conversation with their son about not running at night. That was a fear that they held. And I know a lot of people have a lot of rebuttals for the concept of white privilege, and that's a whole other conversation. But something that I think is part of that privilege is the ability to look away. The thing is that if I wanted to look away and not have these conversations and pretend it's not happening, the truth of the matter is I might have the ability to do so because it doesn't immediately impact my life. But we have to understand that we have brothers and sisters that they don't have the luxury of looking away. Like, they can't pretend this isn't happening. And so no matter how uncomfortable the conversation might be, no matter how awkward people might feel about having the conversation, we have to look at it. As the church, we mourn with those who mourn. And so we have to get rid of the concept of being able to look away.
Yeah. I think, to be really clear, every Black father has to have two conversations with his sons in particular. It's not only the sex talk, but it's also, this is how you walk down a street. This is how, if you are approached by an officer, this is how you conduct yourself. If you are approached in a grocery store or in a department store, make sure your hands are always available. Be careful about wearing hoodies. I mean, it's not just a narrative that's made up. It is real, and it's sad. But if we don't have that conversation and our sons find themselves in an awkward position, we have failed our boys by not having that conversation. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who didn't know that. He didn't realize that. And he just wept because he said, it never occurred to me that that's a conversation that you would have to have. It's just reality. It's a sad reality.
Yeah.
But if we really want to have conversations about reconciliation and justice in the church, we have to know all of the conversations that play into it.
Yeah. Wow.
I think the question that just keeps coming into my head is, of course, we want to speak to leaders and pastors, ministers, people who are growing in their leadership, have been maybe pastoring for 3 or 4 years and are just maybe experiencing this kind of stuff in their churches for the first time. Has there ever been a time where there was a situation that you had to deal with personally regarding racism in your church that you might be able to say what you did, maybe what worked, maybe what didn't work, the best way to approach it for somebody that is maybe looking for that resource?
Well, the situation with the rally that was held in Charlottesville a couple of years ago down in Virginia, I remember preparing. I was traveling on my way home from a meeting that I had to attend, and I was preparing for that Sunday morning message. We were doing a series in the Psalms, and as I'm sitting in the airport, going over my notes for the next morning, I heard the Lord say, "Really, that's what you're going to preach." And I knew right then that I was being confronted by the Spirit, that I did not want to address the topic from the pulpit because I was afraid. We were a multi-ethnic church, and sometimes, quite honestly, I think these topics are the hardest in the multi-ethnic church because we look at it and say, but we're worshiping together. And while that may be true, I think having the hard conversations is about doing life together. That's where I was being challenged. So I went to scripture and grounded what I needed to say biblically. So it wasn't just, I'm pulling this out of the media and I'm sounding an alarm. And, I made it very clear that when we talk about issues of racism in the church, we come from a place of what does Jesus do? How does he see this? And there are all kinds of examples in the Gospels where Jesus either directly or roundabout addressed issues of racism that were going on, even as he walked this earth, building from a biblical background, what it is when we say that all races, tongues, tribes, and nations are before the throne of God, and why it is that we must approach and speak out against anything that does not represent that. and just made it very clear, what's going on is not of the kingdom. If we are going to be kingdom people, then we must represent that here. As I was finishing up the sermon, I just gave some practical things, and then helping people become educated through reading and conversations, roundtables regarding the issue of racism and injustice. I'm not necessarily the kind of person that feels that the very first thing you need to do is, here are my practical steps, because I think sometimes we do without really fully understanding what the issue is. In that case, I felt that there needed to be some steps that needed to be taken immediately. And then worked to have conversations with as many people as I could regarding, hey, if we're going to be the multi-ethnic church that we say we are, the multicultural church that we say we are, these are conversations we're going to have. I think the other thing that is important that was helpful for me is to recommend some books to people. Let's start reading about these things, not just in society, but ways that this has affected the church. Because I think education on this is also key. It's easy to look at what's going on in the media and make quick judgments on what you see in the media. But if you have an education of what has happened historically, not only in society, but in the church, your eyes begin to be open when you see these things and go, okay, this is what I need to speak out against. And we're not talking race, but we're also talking, socioeconomic injustice.
Right.
There's more to it than just the race and cultural things. The socioeconomic injustice plays a huge part in this topic, and was a huge part of what was on the heart of God when he went after Israel. He was saying to his people, you're cheating the poor. They can't even come and make their sacrifices without you putting some kind of tax on them. And that is not my heart. So injustice, as Dr. King quoted, injustice anywhere means injustice everywhere.
What are some books that you would encourage people to read?
There is one called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. It's a hard read. It's a tough read, but it's important to understand what racism has been like in America and in the church. Another one that was written by Brian Moritz called Insider Outsider. That's a more recent one. Again, very tough read, but really gives a full picture. It's an older book now, and I know they're coming out with updates to the stats. That should be out either later this summer or next year. It's called Divided by Faith. That would be a great book to read. And then there's a follow-up to that called United by Faith. These are all good books that help us to understand how this all plays into the church and how we address it. Another one her name is Corey Edwards, and the name of the book is The Elusive Dream. The Elusive Dream. Very good book that I think is worth reading.
What I do feel like happens sometimes is what you said before, the concept of, well, we're a multi-ethnic, multicultural church. If people are not seeing blatant, in-your-face racism, they almost can pretend that it's not happening. I know that there's this concept about implicit bias. I read that there was this study that they had people answer questions, and actually what they were testing was not what their answer was, because people knew what the right answer was or the answer that they wanted to say, but what they were actually testing was the amount of time it took them to answer. And they found that people had a little bit of a lag time, very small, but a lag time in questions that involved different ethnicities. And what they said from that is, these people are not, blatantly racist, but there was this implicit bias.
Well, I think being able to simply say, even if I'm not aware of it, there's probably some unconscious biases that I have and that I approach life with, and things that I would not even realize I was putting forth that need to be addressed. You only address those things if they're brought up, if they're challenged When I say challenged, I mean like confronted.
Pointed out.
Yeah, pointed out in the moment. Our natural tendency on those things is to say, well, that's not me. But we only go after those implicit biases if we're willing to say, maybe I need to think about that. Maybe I need to have more conversation around that. We don't necessarily make it a safe place to have those conversations. I can tell you, as a Black man, it sometimes feels unsafe for me to address these topics because the assumption is, well, he's bringing that up. There must be some anger in him. No, I'm bringing it up because it needs to be addressed.
Right.
But this would be a biased thing. I think the picture or the assumption is if you bring it up, then you must be the angry Black man who just needs to get this out. When I bring it up because it needs to be addressed. I think for the church to be the voice that God has intended the church to be, we have to be willing to say there are things in the church in the area of injustice that we have let go unsaid and unaddressed for a long time. And we have to repent of it.
Right.
And repenting is not simply naming it, it is turning from it and walking a different way.
Right.
And there will be difficult conversations. There will be places where we'll have to extend forgiveness to each other. There will be places where there are misunderstandings and you'll have to talk through them. But at the end of the day, it's the church's call and responsibility to represent to the non-church world, this is how we live. This is how we go after relationship. And if I can, right there, the word relationship, none of this happens without relationship.
Right.
Which means we've got to be in proximity, close proximity with one another. And if I'm in an area where I don't have people who are of a different race or a different cultural background, then I still need to be proactive in placing myself near people or with people who are different than I am and building the relationship so that we create a safe environment to have the tough conversation.
That's good. So for the church, have these difficult conversations, read some of these books, get more education on the topic. I know that you said, repenting as a church, which is not just naming it, but turning away from it. And you also really briefly mentioned biblical lamenting. Can you just touch on that just a little bit for us?
Yeah, lamenting is different than I think repenting. In fact, I think lamenting precedes repentance. You look at the book of Joel, where God called his people to a solemn assembly. It was first in that solemn assembly that the things that were pointed out caused the people to lament. They got to a place of godly sorrow. The way God called it to them is, listen, I don't want you to rend your robe. You instantly come in and you want to do something, and so what you know to do is just let me rip my robe. He said, no, rend your heart, not your robe. And the only way they were able to realize that is because they were present with each other, but they were present with God and they were listening. And so lament says it's going after the deep sorrow, but it's not a lament that leaves you hopeless. Lament always has the other side of it, but there is hope. I look at Lamentations, where Jeremiah was lamenting about God's people being in exile, and it seemed that they weren't getting it, and God continually said it, and they just weren't getting it. And he's lamenting over the state of Israel, and then he says this: "But this I call to mind, and in this I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases; his mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." Why that is important is this: I think we want to get to the hope without the lament. And so
Wow.
that's why we're ready to just do something. And God's saying, no, sit with one another, hear from one another, be in relationship with one another. Let the pain of this group become the pain of the entire group. And it's from that that hope then can arise, and we know this is how we go after it.
That's good. If anybody wants to reach out to you, is there any way that they can reach you, or if they want to find out more information about CMA or NIAC?
Sure. If someone wanted to email me, they can email me at kwalker@metrocma.org. If you wanted to find out more about the Christian Missionary Alliance, you can just look at our website, which is cmalliance.org, or the local district one that I oversee is metrocma.org. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. You can look me up there. Be happy to start a conversation with someone if you'd like to.
It was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much.
Great meeting you also. Great meeting you also.
Kelvin, seriously, thank you so much for being on the show. I was only in your class for a semester. And honestly, like from the bottom of my heart, being in your class and learning from you has been incredibly impactful in my life and in my ministry. And so I'm seriously just really honored to talk to you. And it's exciting to talk to you again. It's been a while.
I am very encouraged and thankful that on your podcast you are taking this on. I'm very thankful, very encouraged that you see this as not just something that is a social thing, but that this is also at the heart of the gospel. That the gospel, when viewed holistically, it is the salvation of the soul for eternity and going after life as it's lived here on earth. Jesus teaches us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And if part of the kingdom of God is justice and equity, then these are things that the church needs to address. And I'm so thankful and so happy that you're taking this on, and honored to have been a part of this podcast.
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to hear more, make sure you subscribe. Also, we would love to hear from you. So down below, you can leave us a review or a comment.
Yeah, and you can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook at MessyModernMinistry for any teasers or updates on future episodes. Have a great day, guys.
Bye.